In an increasingly interconnected world today, foreign direct investment has emerged as a pivotal mechanism for growth. For developing and transition economies, FDI has turned out to be an increasingly essential constituent for their economic development. However, the environmental effects of direct investment and growth, in particular on carbon emission, have emerged as a pressing issue in the backdrop of global climate change. Carbon emissions are a significant contributor to climate change
Zaraz
and
pójdę
global
po...
warming.
O, widzę w lustrze. No, jak na dyskotece. No.
Government and organizations are focusing on strategies to reduce emission as they contribute to environmental degradation, extreme weather, and health risk. Foreign direct investment refers to the investment made by companies, individuals in one country into business interests located in another country to acquiring assets or establishing operations. The relationship between FDI and carbon emissions remain ambiguous, context dependent. It is influenced by various factors like regulatory quality, technological spillovers, sectoral composition. The literature gives us two contradictory hypotheses that try to explain the relationship between FDI and carbon emissions. One, pollution heaven hypothesis, which says that FDI can lead to environmental degradation if foreign investment flows to the countries with weaker environmental regulations. Pollution hello hypothesis, which says that FDI can also bring cleaner technologies and promote environmental friendly practices, reducing emissions. Mixed results have been found in previous studies regarding FDI's relationship with carbon emissions. Developing countries often experience increased emissions due to lack of environmental regulations, as suggested by pollution haven hypothesis. Developed countries may benefit from cleaner technologies or service-based FDI that has less impact on the environment. Copeland and Taylor did an in-depth analysis in North-South trade flows to determine the validity of pollution haven hypothesis and concluded that compliance cost and carbon tax in developed countries often lead to the relocation of pollution industries to developing nations, whereas in the case of economic development, many developing nations usually maintain lower environmental standards, which can exacerbate the environmental issues. Ansari in 2019 researched on 5 Asian panels, namely West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia. The study finds that foreign direct investment has a positive as well as a negative effect on CO2 emissions in East and Southeast Asia respectively. FDI reduces CO2 emissions at every stage of economic growth in the Southeast Asian nations, but not in East Asian nations. This implies that FDI policies in East Asian nations environmental pollution, in turn lowering environmental quality. Lee conducted a research on a panel of 19 nations of G20. His research supports the pollution halo hypothesis and put forward that FDI is critical in achieving a balance between economic growth and environmental sustainability. The objectives of the present study are to measure the impact of FDI on carbon emissions at different quantiles of emission and to assess the role of the control variables like GDP, GDP square, trade, rule of law, and population in moderating the relationship between FDI and emissions. The study is conducted on a panel of 9 emerging Asian nations, namely Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, China, Vietnam, and South Korea. The time period of the study is from 1999 through 2023. Econometric technique of quantile regression has been used in the study. Further taken over by Dr. Monika Gaur.
Thank you, Jyoti. So in this paper, we have utilized the quantile regression technique. And I would like to highlight why have we, employed quantile regression over and above OLS. First, because of the robustness of its results, because it is robust to the outlying observations that are there in our data. Secondly, we see that quantile regressions are useful to capture the heterogeneous effects. So it allows us to treat our covariates differently, such that we can have different observations pertaining to the lower quantiles vis-a-vis to the higher quantiles. So we can leverage these heterogeneous effects using the quantile regression. Thirdly, very important distributional insights can come from the quantile regressions, which are otherwise averaged out in the OLS results. So we are trying to leverage those distributional insights into our study, which was otherwise not found in the existent literature, which extensively being discussed by Dr. Dhamija over here. So we have tried to uniquely utilize the technique of quantile regression in our model. Let me take you through our model, which has the CO2 variable as the left hand variable as the dependent variable, and we have FDI, GDP square, trade openness, rule of law, and population as the independent variables to our models. We are trying to understand how FDI impacts emissions, of course, in different quantiles. Also, we are trying to study the Kuznets relationship for each and every quantile under study, while controlling for trade openness and for rule of law and population. So, while discussing these variables, I've already taken you through. We have included GDP square to understand the environmental Kuznets curve relationship. We have used trade openness to understand how trade sort of impact the relationship between FDI and CO2 emissions. We have leveraged rule of law, which captures how institutional quality affects or how rule of law per se impacts emissions, because in the emerging countries and also for the developed nations, rule of law matters a lot. How importantly you are leveraging your institutional frameworks, how are you leveraging your laws, and how you're abiding by them such that they can sort of control your CO2 emissions. And followed by which we have taken population, which has been a problem for emerging nations, so we have controlled for that variable in our model. Taking you through the results, observing the lowest quantile, we have observed that GDP per capita have a positive and significant impact, such that GDP growth leads to a higher emissions and higher consumptions of energy. However, the square GDP shows a negative coefficient, which is a classic Kuznets curve relationship. Also, decoupling emissions from economic growth is being observed in the lowest quantile. Followed by this, we have seen that FDI have a negative impact onto the emissions, such that we see that if FDI enhances, so CO2 emissions goes down, which means that we are seeing some cleaner technology transfers and environmental expertise in the lower quintiles. So, or maybe we say that we have a good environmental standards in the host countries. Talking about the population overall, we have seen that there's a positive and significant impact on emissions, because high population pressures are being exerted. So we need we see a larger emission footprints to that. Trade as a percentage of GDP, again, a positive impact on emissions have been shown, because we've seen that, carbon intensive technologies are being used and such that we have a higher emissions to that. Vis-a-vis for rule of law, we have seen a very interesting negative coefficient on the CO2 emissions, such that if we say that we have more or better laws, a better implementation of laws, better reflection of those institutional frameworks, better governance mechanisms, we see that emissions tend to fall. Specifically for the lower quintiles, if of course, I have not incorporated the table over here. If we see the coefficients are very significantly larger for the lower quintiles emerging Asian nations versus the higher quintiles. Moving ahead to the middle quantiles, we see that again GDP per capita has a positive effect on emissions, showing again growth is a key driver to emissions, where the square GDP is having a negative and but statistically significant impact. So we are saying that again, environmental Kuznets curve holds true even for the middle quantiles of our study. FDI, on the other hand, the coefficient remains negative. However, very important observations which we have seen in the results, the intensity is falling. So maybe the sign is same for the lower quintiles to the middle, but the intensity is falling both for FDI and also for rule of law. So FDI remains negative coefficient, and so again FDI increases. There's a fall in the emissions. Again, a good technological transfer. However, we can, sort of incorporate for some sectoral impacts over here. Population growth again, exerts population pressure exerts, a higher pressure onto the emissions, followed by a similar positive impact of trade as a percentage of GDP on the emissions. However, over here, rule of law again giving us negative impact onto the emission, strengthening the institutional quality, which is very important in the middle quantiles. However, the intensity is less. I have already mentioned, relative to that of the lowest quantiles. Moving ahead to the next quantiles, which is the amongst the higher quantiles, the environmental Kuznets curve still remains true. GDP and GDP squared again showing positive and negative impacts respectively. Decoupling is still happening in the top quintiles. FDI is giving us a negative impact onto the emissions. So we are saying that technological transfer is still happening. However, the intensity is low. The coefficients are lower as it is minus 0.80. However, for if you see for the lower quintiles, it was as high as 1.20. So we see that FDI is giving us lesser emissions in the top quintiles, but the intensity remains low. Population exerting a positive pressure also for the trade. It is enhancing emissions. Rule of law is reducing emissions, but the coefficients is statistically significant, but the intensity is low. So rule of law have a lesser role to play when we are talking about the countries in the top quintile vis-a-vis the countries which are in the lower quantiles of distribution. So if we actually want to leverage the rule of law indicator over here, then we should be sticking to the countries which are amidst the lower points of the distribution of the emissions. Overall findings to the yeah, so sorry, so the highest quantile, again a strong positive correlation is being observed, and there's a direct impact of GDP on emissions, with the squared GDP showing negative impacts. FDI again remains negative, and again signs of technological transfers are being observed. Similarly, the coefficients for population, trade, and rule of law remains the same. Rule of law weakening the emissions, impact of emissions onto any economy, and to certain extents, we have also observed some, what do we say, combined variables for rule of law and FDI. We have seen that the impact of rule of law is weakening over as we move ahead of the quantiles. As far as the overall results are concerned, we see that environmental Kuznets curve holds true, and with the economic growth or with the increase in GDP per capita, we see emissions and carbon footprints. With the squared GDP term being negative, so marginal emissions are of course falling, but yes, environmental Kuznets curve holds true in our data set. FDI is bound to reduce emissions in our case. We see some technological transfers happening for the emerging nations. Population is being, a driver to emission. Trade consistently increasing emissions. Even if we are observing for different quantiles, we have distributed for deciles also, the results remain the same. For rule of law, a rule of law is very much capable of reducing emissions. So, we can go for some abatement strategies. We can go for some, carbon laws, subsidies, taxes that would definitely give us some efficiency gains as far as the carbon markets are concerned. So these are the overall results. Concluding our study, we have sort of tried to emphasize on the complex interplay of economic growth, demographics, trade, and governance. And we highlight the need for sort of a targeted policy. I mean, one size fits all may not work well for the emissions, may not work well for the trade. So we should focus on something which is, a policy which is tailor made to quantile specific. We are also talking about the common but differentiated responsibility. So we should sort of look on to the specifics of quantiles, and then we can sort of formulate the policy. Also, we need some integrated approach in the sense that we should have some some standards set for the entire globe. So because pollution is not just the problem of one country or one state or the other, we need to have something which is integrated, such that we can so that we can sort of address sustainable development in a holistic manner. As far as the policy implications are concerned, something which strengthens environmental regulations. We are moving ahead to environmental policies. We are moving ahead in terms of the carbon markets.
Yes.
So, we must establish some strong regulations so that, we sort of solve this problem. Secondly, we should incentivize green markets. We have already seen rule of law giving us good outcomes. So we should sort of incentivize green investments. We can give them tax breaks. We can go for subsidies. We can go for preferred clean technologies. We see technology transfer happening, and they are giving us good results through the FDI variable. So we sort of, we can sort of incentivize green investments. Also, we can go for collaborative frameworks. We can go for sharing agreements where we can sort of transfer green technology. And also we see a very strong impact of public-private partnership. So we can go for collaborative ways because we see that market failure happens in carbon markets.
Sorry, your time is over now. Can you just summarize
Yeah.
within few seconds?
Yeah.
Just
So
few seconds.
lastly, we should go for capacity building. So we should go for skill enhancement and knowledge such
Just
that we
summarize
get.
with 2
Thank
lines,
you.
please.
We are grateful, and we are grateful for Center for Business and Economic Research for giving us this opportunity.